Vashnara closed her eyes in the snow, waiting for death. She was wounded, alone, and the cold of Ashenveld had already begun to erase everything. When she opened them, there was a man preparing dinner in an iron pot. That was only the beginning, but fate was keeping something neither of them could have ever imagined. The sky over Ashenveld was the color of old iron when Vashnara fell. It was not a dramatic fall. There was no cry, no final battle, no grand gesture from someone who knows they are dying. Her knees simply gave out, slowly, as if her body had made the decision alone after 2 days carrying what her mind refused to admit. She went face first into the snow, her face buried in the cold white, and her eyes closed before she even realized she had fallen. Her right shoulder burned, or rather it had burned. Now it was just numb, frozen along with the rest of her arm, along with the fingers that no longer responded, along with the side of her neck where the blood had stopped flowing hours ago. She did not know if that was good or bad. Probably bad. 5 years had passed since the end of the war. 5 years since humans and orcs had looked at their dead scattered across the field and decided, in collective and exhausted silence, that it was enough. Peace had spread across the central territories, through the villages, through the border towns. Humans and orcs lived side by side, not always without tension, but without blood. Nobody hunted anybody. That was law, custom, and common sense all at once. But Ashenveld was far from all of that, far enough that peace had not arrived with the same firmness, and close enough to nowhere that some men figured the rules of the world did not apply out here. 9 bounty hunters had ambushed her 2 days ago, and the bullet they had put in her right shoulder had been their opening argument. She had answered by killing 2 of them and running. She had crossed the Gren River with the icy water up to her waist. She had lost her horse to the current. After that, it had been nothing but forest and snow and cold, cutting deeper than any knife. The wound in her shoulder had stopped bleeding, but not because it was healing. It was frozen. Her whole body was frozen. Now she lay still, and the snow kept falling over her, gentle and indifferent, the way snow always falls over things that are no longer moving. Vashnara had been a warrior of the Kar-Val clan since she was old enough to hold a blade. She had fought in 17 battles before the war ended. She had survived ambushes, river crossings, 3 broken ribs, and a blade through her left thigh that had taken 6 weeks to stop weeping. She had never once thought about dying like this. Quiet, alone, face down in the snow with no one watching and no one to carry the news back. She was 31 years old. Her green skin had gone dark and dull with the cold. Her pointed ears were packed with snow. Her small tusks, which she had always kept filed smooth out of personal preference rather than shame, pressed into the frozen ground beneath her face. Somewhere above her, through the dark and the falling white, the trees stood silent. She felt something strange then, not pain, not cold, but a flicker of something she could not name, a sense that she had been here before, not in this exact spot, not in this exact snow, but in this exact moment of letting go, as if some part of her recognized the shape of it. Then the feeling faded, and there was only the dark and the quiet and the snow coming down, and her eyes stayed closed. She did not choose to stop. She simply stopped. Damien Morrow had left the house before dawn because the woodpile was running low, and he had opinions about being cold that could be summarized as not interested. He was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from decades of actual work rather than vanity, with a grey-streaked beard he trimmed when he remembered and forgot when he didn't. He had been a blacksmith once, a soldier before that, and the combination had left him with hands that knew how to build things and a mind that knew how to assess damage without flinching. Now he was just a solitary farmer with an old horse, a dog of uncertain breed, and firm convictions about how to properly season a stew. The farm sat at the edge of the Ashenveld lowlands, far enough from the nearest town that nobody came by unless they meant to, which suited him perfectly. He had his axe over one shoulder and his lantern in his hand when the horse stopped. The animal was old and slow and rarely spooked at anything anymore, which was why Damien paid attention when it planted its hooves and refused to move forward. He lifted the lantern and looked ahead along the tree line. The contrast was what he saw first, dark green against white. Something large and very still lying between two snow-covered roots at the edge of the forest. He walked forward alone, leaving the horse on the path. He crouched down in the snow beside her and looked carefully before he touched anything, a soldier's habit. Checking the ground before committing weight to it. Orc, female, large, even by orc standards, broad shoulders, long limbs, the kind of build that spoke of a life spent doing hard things. Her clothing was leather and hide, practical and worn, with small bone and crystal decorations along the collar that he recognized as northern clan work. There was a knife at her hip, a rifle slung across her back, and a wound on her right shoulder that someone had tried to pack with cloth and failed to close properly. Damien put 2 fingers against the side of her neck. A pulse, faint, irregular, but there. He stood up and looked at his horse for a moment. The horse looked back at him, with the blank patience of an animal that had long since accepted that its owner made unreasonable decisions. She was too large to carry, too heavy to lift cleanly, and the path back to the farm was uneven and long. He stood in the cold for a moment and thought about it the way he thought about most problems, practically without drama. Then he unslung his axe and went to work. He cut 2 thick branches, stripped them fast, and lashed dried straw between them with leather cord from his pack. It took 12 minutes to build something that would hold her weight. It took another 20 minutes, several creative uses of the language his mother had never approved of, and the full cooperation of his horse to get her rolled onto it and secured. The horse leaned into the harness without complaint and began pulling. The farm appeared through the trees as the sky shifted from black to the pale grey of early morning. Damien got the back bedroom door open, got the makeshift stretcher alongside the bed, and moved her across with the kind of careful mechanical effort that left no room for second-guessing. He covered her with 2 wool blankets. He looked at the wound. He looked at her face, still dark green, the small tusks pressing slightly into the pillow. Then he went to the kitchen, put water on to boil, and started a stew. It was what there was to do while he waited to see if she came back. From the other room, through the walls, the pot began to bubble. He stirred it and muttered about the salt, which was almost gone, which meant a trip to town, which he had been putting off for 2 weeks already. He did not think about whether he had made the right decision. The decision was already made. That was the thing about decisions. They only needed making once. Vashnara woke because of the smell. Her eyes opened slowly, heavy as wet stone, and for a long moment she did not try to understand anything. She simply registered. Ceiling, wood, dark beams, thick. Heat, real heat, dry and steady coming from somewhere to her left. The smell was meat and herbs, and something faintly smoky coming from the other side of a wall. Through the gap of a half-open door, she could see a man's back. He was standing at a stove, stirring a pot, and he was complaining, not to anyone in particular, just complaining, quietly and with conviction, about the state of his salt supply. She tried to move her right arm. The pain detonated from her shoulder to her fingertips, and she went completely still, jaw tight, breathing through her nose until the white-hot edge of it dulled back to something manageable. When it passed, she lay without moving and took inventory. She was in a bed. The blankets were wool and smelled of wood smoke. Her boots had been removed. Someone had put thick socks on her feet, heavy, slightly too large, clearly belonging to the man in the kitchen. Her right shoulder was bandaged with clean cloth, tightly wrapped. The wound had been cleaned. She could tell by the smell of the salve and by the absence of the deep infected heat that had been building for 2 days. She was alive because someone had made a deliberate choice to keep her that way. Her left hand found the knife at her hip. Still there? She did not draw it. But she kept her hand on the handle and watched the man through the gap in the door for a long time. He did not look in her direction once. The fever came that night. She knew it was coming before it arrived. She had been through enough field wounds to recognize the warning signs. It arrived hard and fast, the kind that made the ceiling move and turned sound into something thick and distorted. She was only half aware of the man coming in with a wet cloth and cool water, of his hands efficient and impersonal on her forehead, of him saying something low and matter-of-fact that she could not quite follow. The second day was the worst. The third day, the fever broke like a storm clearing, sudden and complete, and she lay in the wet wreckage of it feeling scraped clean and very tired. On the morning of the fourth day, she sat up without assistance. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking at her hands. Green skin, scarred at the knuckles, still slightly pale from blood loss. Hands that had held blades and bows and pulled her body up cliff faces and riverbanks. Hands that should have been buried under the snow of Ashenveld 2 days ago, frozen stiff and undiscovered until spring. From the kitchen came the sound of metal on metal, someone fixing something, and the smell of broth waiting. Vashnara looked at the door for a long moment. Then she stood up, steadied herself against the wall, and walked toward it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a rusted hinge in one hand and a small tool in the other, working at it with the focused calm of a man who had no pressing appointments. A bowl of broth sat on the far side of the table, still steaming. Vashnara stood in the doorway. She was dressed in her own clothes, which someone had dried and folded at the foot of the bed. Her right arm was strapped against her chest with a length of clean cloth. Her feet were still in the borrowed socks. She stood straight, which cost her something, and looked at him directly, which cost her nothing. He glanced up briefly, then back down at the hinge. "There's broth," he said. She did not move for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and sat down on the other side of the table. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her accent was thick, the Northern Orc dialect, consonants stacked hard against each other, and her voice was rough from 3 days of fever and silence. He turned the hinge over in his hands and inspected the joint. "Because you were dying at the edge of my woods, and I'm not the kind of man who steps over that." That was the whole answer. No pause before it, no searching for the right words, no careful performance of virtue. Just a plain statement, the same way he might explain why he fixed a broken fence rather than leaving it. Vashnara looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the bowl with her left hand and drank. It was good, not complicated. Root vegetables, a piece of dried meat, herbs she didn't recognize, but it was warm and real and made with attention. And she'd been eating cold-dried strips from a pack for 2 weeks before the ambush. She said nothing about how good it was. She finished the bowl to the bottom. He stood to refill it without being asked. She let him. They did not talk much that morning. He told her his name, Damien Morrow, and she told him hers, and he repeated it back correctly on the first try without comment, which she noted. He told her she had lost significant blood and that the shoulder would need another week before she should test it. She told him she had survived worse. He said that was probably true, based on the other scars. She looked at him sharply. He shrugged. Had to clean the wound properly, wasn't looking. She decided to believe him, not because she fully did, but because it was the more useful interpretation. When she stood to go back to the bedroom, the room tilted slightly, and she put a hand on the table. He did not move to help her. He just waited, doing nothing, giving her the space to find her own balance. When she had it, she walked out of the kitchen. That was, she thought later, the thing that earned him the most. Recovery was slow, as it always was after a real wound. Vashnara spent the first 2 days learning to do everything with her left hand, pouring water, carrying wood, buttoning the leather collar of her jacket. She was not good at it. She was used to being good at things, which made the not being good at it worse, but she worked at it steadily and without complaint until she stopped dropping things. On the third day, she found a section of fence on the east side of the property that was leaning at an angle that would become a collapse before winter was over. She studied it for a while, figured out what it needed, and spent the morning fixing it one-handed with wire and a post from the barn. Damien came by mid-morning, looked at the repair, and said nothing for a moment. "That's a better brace than the one I had before," he said finally. "Your wire was loose," she said. "I know," he said. "I kept meaning to fix it." She organized the barn tools in the afternoon, which he observed from the doorway, with an expression that suggested he found her system strange, but was not going to argue with it. While moving a rack of rusted hooks to the far wall, she noticed an old reserve rifle hanging behind the back door. Dusty, but the mechanism looked intact when she checked it. She said nothing about it and moved on. She set a rope snare for rabbits the following morning. One hand, cold fingers, a particular knot her mother's mother had taught her when she was 4 years old. It caught 2 rabbits by midday. He looked at the snare with what she had come to recognize as his particular version of respect. A long look, a brief nod, no unnecessary words. "Your clan teach you that?" he asked. "Every Karval child learns to hunt before they learn to walk properly," she said. "Must be some clan," he said. She looked at him. "It was," she said. He heard the past tense and did not push at it, which was the right thing to do. There was something in that week that neither of them named, a lightness that had no right to be there, thin and fragile, like new ice over fast water. In the evenings after dinner, they sometimes sat on the porch, him with his pipe, her sharpening her ceremonial knife with her good hand, and the silence between them was not the silence of 2 people tolerating each other. It was quieter than that. The comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who have stopped pretending the other one is a threat. She did not let herself think too much about it. At night, she slept with her back to the wall and the knife on the blanket beside her, which was not about him. It was just how she slept. It had been how she slept for 15 years, but she noticed that she was sleeping deeply, which was not something she had done in a long time. On the morning of the 12th day, Damien's old dog woke up growling. The animal was 15 years old and slept through thunderstorms without twitching. When it growled before dawn, Damien was already out of bed before he was fully awake, moving by instinct toward the gun rack beside the door. He took the shotgun, checked it, and went to the front window. 2 horses on the dirt road. 2 riders, sitting easy, in no hurry. Men he had never seen before. But the kind of men you recognized anyway, because of how they sat and how they wore their guns, and the particular way they looked at a property as they approached, assessing and measuring and not bothering to hide it. Vashnara appeared in the hallway behind him, rifle already in her left hand. She had heard the dog. 2 of the 9, she said quietly. The others are not far. Damien went out to the porch with the shotgun. The men reined in at the fence. They were polite about it, which was the most dangerous kind. They explained that they had tracked blood to the Gren River, lost it there, and spent 12 days working outward in a grid, farmhouse by farmhouse, moving slow and methodical, the way men do when they're being paid by the head and not the hour. They said that the peace declared 5 years ago was fine for cities, but out here in Ashenveld, things were different. They said the orc was worth 40 coins, and he was harboring someone else's problem. Damien told them, in a voice completely without heat, that they had until the count of 3 to get off his property. He counted to 3. What followed was fast and ugly, and not the kind of thing that could be described as going well for anyone. One of the men drew first. Damien put a shot into the fence post beside his horse, which caused the animal to bolt sideways and throw his aim. The second man came around the other side of the fence, and Vashnara stepped out from behind the barn wall with the reserve rifle she had found behind the back door, firing left-handed, clipping his shoulder and sending him down into the dirt. There was a pause, the specific pause that happens after gunfire, when everyone is checking themselves for damage and recalculating. The first man, back on his horse, looked at Damien, then at Vashnara, then at Damien again. Then he hauled his horse around and rode hard, the second man dragging himself back into the saddle and following. They left one horse behind, spooked loose at the fence. Damien had a cut along his left forearm where a bullet had grazed it. Vashnara had torn the repair on her right shoulder. She could feel the stitches pulling and the warmth of blood seeping back into the bandage. She pressed her hand against it and stood watching the road until the sound of hooves faded. The dog had stopped barking. It stood in the yard, tail low, watching the same direction. 7 left, Vashnara said. I know, Damien said. They went inside. That night, Damien sewed his own arm by lamplight at the kitchen table. Vashnara sat across from him and re-lashed her shoulder with leather strips, biting down on a piece of folded cloth while she worked the knot tight. Neither of them talked about the 2 riders who had come and gone. They did not need to. 7 men were still out there. 2 had come back. That meant the others would hear about the farm within days, if not sooner, if the 2 of them were smarter than they looked and had left someone watching the road. A farm at the edge of a field in the middle of winter was not a place to make a last stand. There were too many approaches, too few walls, not enough ammunition for a sustained fight. Vashnara ran the calculations the way she had been trained to run them, quickly, without sentiment, from the ground up. The numbers did not improve no matter how she arranged them. Damien set down his needle and looked at the lamp. He did not say, "You should leave." He did not say, "This is your problem, not mine." He did not say anything at all. But she watched him not saying it and understood that he was thinking through the same map she was. She sat with her ceremonial knife in her lap and looked at her hands for a long time. She thought about the bowl of broth on the first morning, about the fence post she had fixed and the snare she had set, and the evening silences on the porch, about the fact that he had repeated her name correctly on the first try without making anything of it, about the socks. She thought about what it meant that he had gone out to the porch with his shotgun without hesitation, had stood between her and 2 armed men, had counted to 3 and meant it. She thought about the 7 remaining hunters and the math of a farm in winter. Then she thought about the one thing she had not let herself think about all week, which was that Damien Morrow was the only person in years who had looked at her and seen a person with a long day, rather than a target or a threat or a problem to be solved. That was exactly why he could not pay the price of having found her. The lamp burned low. Outside, the snow had started again. She could hear it whispering against the window. She made her decision. She did not announce it. She just made it, quietly, the way she made every decision that mattered, alone and without ceremony. She sat with it for a long time after that, the lamp burning down to almost nothing, the snow whispering steadily at the glass, until the house went completely still and the decision stopped being a thought and became a thing she was already doing. When Damien finally went to bed, she stayed in the kitchen chair with her knife on her knee and her eyes on the door, waiting for the silence to deepen into the kind that means it is time to move. Somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, she stood up from the chair. The decision had already been made. Sitting there had just been the last part of making it. She moved through the house slowly, careful not to make sound. Her boots were on before she reached the hallway. She took the ceremonial knife, the rifle, and the provisions that fit in a small pack. Dried meat, hard bread, a water skin. Nothing that would leave him short, nothing he would need. The bounty hunter's horse was in the barn, tied to the post she had fixed. She left it there. He would find it in the morning, and a horse in winter was worth more than whatever she could cover on foot before dawn. She was leaving him something useful. That felt right. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. The table was the same table. The lamp was out. The pot hung cold on the hook above the stove. On the table, where the bowl had been every morning, she set her bracelet. It was bone and dark green crystal, fitted close, the work of her grandmother's hands, passed from mother to daughter through 3 generations of Carval women who had done hard things and survived them. It was the most valuable thing she owned, not in coin, but in the way that objects absorb meaning over time and become more than themselves. She had no letter. She did not write in the human tongue. But the bracelet said enough, for anyone who knew how to listen to what objects say. She crossed the yard and stepped into the open field, the same field where she had fallen, where the snow had been coming down indifferently and the cold had been closing in from all sides. She walked without looking back, not because she did not want to, because she knew herself well enough to know that if she turned around and saw the lamplight in the window and the smoke beginning to rise from the chimney in the grey early morning, she would not keep walking, and staying would put him in the path of 7 men who would not count to 3. So she walked. The mountains to the north were dark shapes against the lightening sky. She knew that country, broken and cold, with passes that closed in deep winter and opened again in spring, and settlements so sparse that bounty hunters with city contracts rarely bothered. She had been born in that direction. She would disappear in that direction, which was the best thing she could do with the life that Damien Morrow had pulled out of the snow. The field gave way to the tree line. The tree line gave way to the foothills. She carried with her, in no particular place in her body but everywhere at once, the smell of stew seasoned wrong on a cold night in Ashenveld, the weight of wool blankets, the particular silence of a porch at nightfall when 2 people have stopped performing anything for each other. She carried those things carefully, the way you carry something that cannot be replaced, and she did not look back. Damien woke that morning and knew before he checked. The house had a different quality of quiet to it, not empty in the bad sense, not disturbed, but settled, the way a room settles after someone has left it with care. He lay still for a moment, listening, and then got up and went to the kitchen. The bracelet was on the table, exactly where the bowl had been. He stood looking at it for a long time with his coffee going cold beside him. Dark green crystal and bone, fitted close, the craftsmanship careful and old. He did not know the specific language of it, but he understood the grammar. This is the most valuable thing I had, and I am leaving it here, and that means something. He picked it up, held it in his closed fist for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then he put it in the breast pocket of his vest, close to the chest, and went out to do the morning work. He checked the barn and found the bounty hunter's horse, calm and fed on the oats she had measured out before she left. He found the fence on the east side still solid, the snare in the north field still set, the tools in the barn still arranged in that particular system of hers that made no sense to him but worked. Signs of a person who had been present, and present carefully. He never spoke about Vashnara to anyone, not because he was ashamed, and not because it was a secret exactly, but because some things belong only to the people who lived them, and spreading them around diminishes them somehow. The bracelet stayed in his vest pocket. He brought it inside at night and set it on the shelf above the stove, where he could see it from the table. 3 weeks later, 4 of the hunters came to the farm. The others had apparently cut their losses or moved on to easier work. The 4 who came stood in the yard and asked their questions, and Damien stood on the porch with his shotgun leaning against the doorframe within easy reach, and he told them he had treated a wounded traveller who had moved on before he learned her name. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without decoration, looking each of them in the eye in turn. 2 of them stared at him hard for a long moment, the kind of stare meant to find the crack in a story. There was no crack. There was just a man on his porch in the cold, waiting for them to finish. They left without pushing it. People tended to believe Damien when he spoke because he sounded exactly like a man with nothing to hide, which was because he never hid things. He simply chose what to say. 2 years passed. In the spring of the 2nd year, the road to Dawnhold reopened after winter, and he went to the market for the first time in months. He needed hardware. He did not need conversation. He got both. Her name was Greta. She was a schoolteacher, a war widow, with an easy laugh and opinions about cooking that were, if anything, stronger than his. They talked for 3 hours beside a hardware stall without either of them planning to. He came back the next week, and the week after that. They married in the farm's garden on an afternoon in autumn, with his old dog lying at the foot of the improvised altar, and half the village crowded cheerfully against the fence. Greta wore her mother's yellow dress. Damien wore a clean shirt and the vest with the bracelet in the pocket. 2 winters after that, they sat together on the porch in the evening, 2 old rocking chairs, shoulders almost touching, fingers laced together on the armrest between them. The sky over Ashenveld was clear and very deep, full of stars, and a wide low moon that poured silver over the snow-covered field. Greta said she was happy. Damien said he was too. They sat like that for a long time, rocking slowly, the coal in his pipe fading. The field in front of them was the same field it had always been, the one the snow fell on indifferently, the one where things ended and things began and things passed through on their way to somewhere else, somewhere in the mountains to the north, beyond the reach of any bounty hunter or contract or old war. Vashnara was alive. She had rebuilt herself in the cold and the high passes, in the sparse settlements where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own survival. She had not forgotten Ashenveld. She did not need to forget it. It had become one of those things she carried without weight, the kind of memory that does not drag, but accompanies. She had left a bracelet on a table and walked into the dark, and in doing so had kept something intact that would have broken if she had stayed. On the porch, without knowing it, 2 people were warm because a warrior had chosen to be cold. Damien looked out at the field. Greta leaned her head against his shoulder. The lamp above the door burned steady in the still winter air, throwing a small circle of gold into the dark, the way a fire does, not large enough to light everything, but enough to matter to the people standing inside it.